On my HIO page where I host my game projects, I keep a list of some favorite games that I found on the website. I love perusing it for free games to see what kind of passion projects people are coming up with. Free games are an avenue for experimentation, and more often than not, the most interesting finds barely qualify as games. That is the case with Interactive Meadow 64, a free browser game where you play as a red blob and walk around a meadow receiving positive messages from objects. There are no enemies or score, just wholesome interactions filtered through the nostalgic lens of crayon illustration. This simple game hit me hard, probably because I played it at just the right time when I needed something like it. Interactive Meadow 64 was the inspiration for wanting to create a wholesome non-game game. Despite having only developed games in 2D so far, I am a competent 3D modeler. I have about 3 years of experience in Blender and a bunch of models uploaded to Sketchfab. All of my models are free to download and use in commercial projects. I'll put a link in the description to check them out. Despite being intimidated by programming in 3D, it was about time that I developed a 3D game project. But before I did any coding, I had to create a character to move around. I knew the game was going to need several characters with 3D models, each to give positive messages to the player. I decided to use animals for characters, which established the theme, a petting zoo. The game will be a mini sandbox petting zoo where you can pet animals to spawn speech bubbles with messages from the animals. For the sake of preventing scope creep when making a 3D game, I knew I had to model in a low poly aesthetic, so I'm giving the game a retro N64 look. The first animal I made was a goose, and I loved the way it came out. I posted the goose on Twitter back in 2021 when I started the project. I have a tendency to abandon projects for months at a time to possibly never return to them. So after I finished my goose in Blender and Photoshop, I started a new project with a 3D URP template and started on the player movement and automated animal movement, and this is how it turned out. I started this at a time when I was new to Unity and C#, and I had so far only coded menu-based games. Seeing how my scripts were turning out, I decided for the first time to use an asset from the Unity Asset Store. I downloaded the Unity Starter Assets first-person controller, and just like that, the hardest programming in the game was done. Or so I thought, as this asset would later cause me trouble. This is when I learned about Unity's built-in character controller class, which helped me to code the animal behavior. I programmed the goose to walk around to random targets and to idle for random intervals. The next time I returned to the project, I went to work on the rest of the animals I needed to make up the petting zoo. Ms. has great videos on creating models in N64 and PS1 styles. There is also a website called the Model Resource where you can download models ripped from old games. The models I create all start out as primitive cubes. They get mirrored and then modeled with loop cuts and knife cuts. Because I'm not using smooth shading, I can use triangles to my heart's content. I used a mixture of deformed limbs and separate objects as limbs, which is consistent with the N64 style. I'm using the N64 as a reference for style, but I'm not sticking to those limitations too strictly. I'm using more advanced lighting than N64 games typically have, because I want to have a day and night cycle. For the texturing, I found images of the animals online and used Photoshop to downsize them to 64 by 64 square textures. I then placed the UVs on the model along the image to quickly get a low resolution texture. I then made a second UV map for every object and made proper UVs without overlap and with consistent sizing. I baked the original texture from the original messy UVs onto the clean ones. This is a really quick and dirty way of creating textures, and it only really works with resolutions as low as the N64. I made a horse, a cow, a pig, a sheep, and several more animals. I put all the animals together in a test environment. I scoured the internet for free animal sound effects and kept notes for the licenses to make sure I was attributing everything correctly. I also made a model for the player's arm and created a petting mechanic. Next, it was time to create the environment. For the first draft, I wasn't going to worry about crafting an interesting level design, so I created a mostly flat farmland with a river and pond and a barn scene. I played around with fog, which I initially liked, but later turned off. The grass texture is stretched more than the other textures. That is in style with the N64, which had to use small textures for large objects. I imported a song from my game Whale Well as placeholder to see what the game would feel like with music. For the second draft of the environment, I added mountains and a cave with secret treasure hidden behind a waterfall. I also created a coop for the chicken and rooster models. I tried writing music for the game, but I'm still unsatisfied with the results. I used Massive X to create a simple, ambient track which my playtester said sounded like Minecraft music, which isn't the vibe I'm going for. I'm considering just using the same music as Interactive N64 because it is copyright free, but that would be the first time I use music I didn't create myself. I'll have to return to the music from scratch in the future. This is a relatively small project, yet it has been on my computer for years, with progress coming in short bursts of inspiration. But with that long of a dev cycle, it's amazing that up till now I've never used version control or GitHub. So after years of putting it off, I finally learned how to use Git, and I went through all of my game projects and backed them up. Using the command prompt scared me away from Git before, but that was before I realized that there was a GUI-based application you can use instead. Being able to create branches and experiment with code is extremely useful, as before Git, I would have to copy my whole project file and reset it up with Unity. No longer will I have a folder of large files with iterations of my game projects. People have requested to view code from me before, so I put all my Pico 8 cartridges up on public repositories. I'll link to them below. That's all the progress on the game I have to report so far. There's still a lot that could be done to make the game into an interactive sandbox, which I will work on for the final game release. With the game this small, I will probably release it on my itch.io page for free when it's ready, so there isn't anything to wishlist. But you can check out my other game projects, Love MO1 and Pico Pals on Steam. Follow my X for Screenshot Saturday posts, and subscribe for more updates. This has been Ryan9, thank you for watching.